have to calculate stroke volume for that. So it said end diastolic volume 135, read end systolic volume 65, 65 minus from 135, cardiac output is 70 mLs per minute. That's a typical stroke volume for a 70 kilogram man. So times the heart rate, then you get the cardiac output. I could give you values in a table for EDV 135, ESD 65, or some other number, and then you use those. So it could be a variety of ways to get you to do the math. Okay. Okay, so here, this intrinsic control is responding to venous return without any input from sympathetic nervous system. This can go up with postural changes. You go from seated to standing, venous return goes down because now the blood pools to your legs. If you go from seated to lying down or standing to lying down, venous return increases. If you stand on your head, venous return increases. If you start doing a lot of exercise with your legs and you're just sitting there, but you start to contract your muscles and do exercise with your lower extremity, venous return is going to increase because you have your skeletal muscles pump. You start to hyperventilate. That's going to increase venous return. So there's various ways without getting the sympathetic nervous system involved to increase the venous return. When you get the sympathetic nervous system involved, then the heart becomes involved. The contractile force goes up, the heart rate goes up, cardiac output goes up. You also get more blood into the venous circulation by sympathetic nervous system constricting the skin, constricting at the GI tract, and shifting that blood into the venous system. Okay, this one. It's kind of strange what's going on. So take it slow, look at what is the x-axis. This is end diastolic volume, EDV, in milliliters. Goes from 0 up to 500. And this is related to the length of the muscle fiber. So if you have more blood in your heart, you're going to have stretched cardiac myocytes. You have less blood in your heart, you're going to have the cardiac myocytes at a shorter resting length. So overlap of actin and myosin is going to change. We have 100, 200, 3, 4, 5. We see up here the dot, it says optimal length, and optimal length is referring to the muscle fiber length. When you have the optimum overlap of actin and myosin, you have the greatest number of cross bridges that can be formed. Therefore, the greatest amount of tension that can be formed. So come to the left side. Sure enough, you are measuring tension. The tension is translating to the pressure to get the blood out. So if you have optimum overlap of actin and myosin, optimum cross-bridge formation, and sarcomere shortening, then you're going to have more pressure due to a smaller volume of the ventricle. And that's going to relate to if you have some weak area, point of least resistance, which is semilunar valve, you increase the overlap and cross-bridge formation, the volume goes down, the pressure goes up, but you got this weak point where the pressure exceeds what's on the other side of that valve. The valve pops open and the blood goes out. So the more optimal overlap, the more force you can apply to those muscles by creating the tension with the cross bridge formation, the greater the stroke volume that will come out of that ventricle. So we're creating tension, but we're seeing it translate into milliliters of blood that is coming out of the heart. So they've taken 2 points here, A, and then increase the blood volume up to B. So you've increased, this is maybe 10 milliliters of, that's 50, maybe 20 milliliters of blood. Hard to read without more of these hatch marks. But we've got a volume increasing here. And so at the original end diastolic volume, you come up to this curve where that point intersects. You just read across, and then you take the reading there. So it looks like maybe this was 145 mLs in, and then you read across here, it's less than 100 mLs, more than 50, so maybe 70 mLs out. That would be, if this was 135, like over here, and we had this overlap of actin and myosin, and we created the tension at 135 mLs, then we would have 70 mLs being ejected. That would be the corresponding number, so that may be what they're intending here. I frankly didn't read text or that part of the text. I tend to look at figures, and if I can't figure out what a figure means, then I go to the text. So that's my way of learning material. Okay, so you increase the volume up another 20 mLs or so, and then you contract the heart. You have the concomitant, meaning going with that volume, and diastolic volume increase, you're going to have equivalent end systolic volume increase. So you can keep increasing your end diastolic volume with increased venous return, but you're going to run up against a point just slightly under 300 mLs where you lose efficiency. The heart won't work beyond that point efficiently, and that's what it says here. Cardiac muscle doesn't normally operate on this side of the length tension curve. What that means is it stretches to a point, and then it's not going to stretch anymore. Why doesn't it stretch to a point? You should know the answer already. What limits overfilling? The what? Fibrous skeleton. Yes. So put these things together as you're coming across them in the textbook. Relate it back to something you've already learned. That's going to strengthen your storage of information in your head. Okay, so normal stroke volume. End diastolic volume must be what they're going for in that previous, this figure right before, 135. And systolic volume is going to be 65. That's the numbers on the trash can graph. And then stroke volume is the difference, 70 mLs. What if we have the same end diastolic volume but increase the force of contraction? We have a decrease in end systolic volume down to 35 mLs. And that's just about the red line point where if you go any lower than that, you're going to pass out. So your sympathetic nervous system has become involved to increase the contractile force, and now instead of 70 mLs, we've gotten 100 mLs out of the heart. End diastolic volume, now instead of 135, we increase it. When you increase this first stroke volume going out on the left side of the heart, eventually it's going to get back, those volumes that you put out with each heartbeat are going to get back to the venous side, and you're going to start to see an increase in venous return. So very shortly, within a minute's time, you're going to have your whole cardiac output going through the circulation and back to your heart. So within a minute's time, your right heart is going to start to see an increase in venous return. Once it sees an increase in venous return, it's getting set to a more optimal overlap of actin and myosin. So even without sympathetic input, it's going to increase the contractile force. But with a combination of sympathetic stimulation where you can get down to this 135 mL, you're going to, and you have a larger end diastolic volume, you get an even bigger stroke volume. So if your heart becomes more efficient, once it can get that increase in volume back to the right heart, then it can become more efficient in pumping out on the left side. I did say specifically that was due to the cardiac output here, cardiac output that's going up on this side, getting back to the right heart. But even faster than that is the shift from the GI tract and the skin. So that volume is going to get back to the right heart before your cardiac output gets around to the heart. So stroke volume going up, haven't influenced heart rate at all in this scenario. So heart rate is constant. By increasing the contractile force, we've got due to sympathetic stimulation, we've got an increase in cardiac output. By increasing end diastolic volume and still stimulating by sympathetic nervous system, we've got an even bigger cardiac output. Now, the sympathetic nervous system, just to remind you, because this is important to keep it in mind, your sympathetic nervous system is not going to increase the force of contraction until you dial back your parasympathetic nervous system. So when you dial back the para, as you're increasing sympathetic input, your heart rate already jumps to 100 beats per minute. That's just by taking away that background resting input from the parasympathetic nervous system. So actually, in this case, your heart rate has already gone up from this point, which is at rest. That's your resting cardiac stroke volume. You've already gone up from 70 beats per minute, 75 beats per minute to 100 beats per minute. So you've gone up there with the dialing back of the parasympathetic input. What Mr. Frank and Mr. Starling then did is say, well, let's see what sympathetic nervous stimulation does to our stroke volume. And so what they did was keep end diastolic volume constant. They then proceeded to change end diastolic volume to see what happened. So they had a constant end diastolic volume, stimulated with their electrodes, the sympathetic nerves, and what happens to the contractile force? It goes up, and then you get point C. So you, at rest, you would have this stroke volume. With sympathetic input, you have this stroke volume. So they set up this curve on the they varied the end diastolic volume and set up this curve. This is our normal resting curve. Then the next thing they did was compare that normal curve to the constant end diastolic volume plus, and then varying the sympathetic input. So they're varying sympathetic input, and this is just one point on the sympathetic input graph. Drop end diastolic volume down, and then get these other points on this part of the curve. Move end diastolic volume up and get these points on the sympathetic influence curve. What they then describe this as is a shift to the left. What happens is that the normal curve moves to the left. It's also elevated so that at each end diastolic volume, you have an increase in stroke volume above the norm. Only when you're at this minimal volume where you can't get any blood out of the heart will you have zero stroke volume. So if you increase the parasympathetic input, what do you expect? Will the curve move to the left again, or will it move to the right? If you increase parasympathetic input to the heart, anybody say it's moving to the right? Some people are saying right. Anybody say it moves to the left? Anybody say it doesn't move at all? Okay. It doesn't move at all. Does the parasympathetic nervous system have any influence on the contractile force of the heart? So that might be a question on exam 2. Do we remember what parasympathetic nervous system does? It affects heart rate, but we're not talking about heart rate here. We're talking about volume that's leaving the heart. So volume, if we're talking about volume per minute, yeah, parasympathetic will influence it, but volume per beat, no, parasympathetic does not affect volume per beat. Only sympathetic nervous system does, and venous return. Okay, so venous return will increase end diastolic volume. Increase in end diastolic volume via intrinsic control, opening those calcium channels, setting your sarcomere at a more optimum length. That will increase the force of contraction, and you'll get an increase in stroke volume. But you won't be going below your resting end systolic volume. So come back to give up on this thing. Okay. Now I lost my pen. Okay. Let's go back to this individual. Okay. Okay. The stroke volume. So what am I looking at? This one. Okay. So normal resting end diastolic volume is 60. If we only increase venous return to the heart, so increase the end diastolic volume, no sympathetic input at all, you have more blood in the heart, the sarcomeres that are more optimal overlap to generate force of contraction. But they're not going to go below this 65 ml in systolic volume. They push more blood out, but they don't get the end systolic volume down below this 65 ml. That's an important point to think about. You're not increasing the contraction beyond the resting length of the sarcomere. Here you are. With the sympathetic nervous system, you not only get it to a more optimal overlap for contraction, but you contract it beyond the resting length. It gets even shorter than it was during normal cycles of the sarcomere's contraction. Okay, so here we've got normal. Is that the next slide? Yeah, okay, come back here. So stroke volume is only going to increase by decreasing the end systolic volume under sympathetic nervous system control, extrinsic control. The sympathetic nervous system increases the heart rate times stroke volume, cardiac output goes up. Sympathetic and increase in venous return are both positively correlated to increased cardiac output. Parasympathetic, because it's inhibitory on the heart rate, if it's dialing up as you're standing on your head, you'll have stroke volume going up, but heart rate going down, and maybe cardiac output not changing at all, or maybe cardiac output actually going down. So normal heart, what moves the graph to the right? It's a failing heart. There's not normal heart now. The heart, something is wrong with it. So you have the normal curve, and then you have the failing heart with no help. So you've got the stroke volume dropping down to half the value that you have if you had a normal heart. So your stroke volume is down if you're in half, and if your heart rate has not changed, or if the failing heart has problems with the pacing as well, you've got a double whammy, because you've got stroke volume decreased by 50%, and if it's got sympathetic nervous system, it's got sinoatrial node problems, that's not facing the heart, you got a heart rate problem. But say sinoatrial node is fine, and you just lost half your stroke volume, your cardiac output is dropping by that 50% on this side of the equation. The sympathetic nervous system will try to compensate for that. It will start to fire to, all your sensors that we'll talk about in the blood vessels, they'll be seeing a decrease in blood pressure because your cardiac output has been decreased because of that 50% decrease in stroke volume. So it's going to fire the sympathetic nerves to the heart, and that's going to try and make the heart contract more forcefully. But the increase in sympathetic tone to the heart is only going to be able to help with about 25% correction. If you keep the volume, the end diastolic volume normal, you only increase the stroke volume by that 25%. If you get the sympathetic nervous system shifting blood from other areas to your heart, your end diastolic volume goes up, then you can get back to a normal stroke volume. So the sympathetic nervous system does do that. Getting the blood back to the heart also is going to still depend on respiratory and skeletal muscle pump. So you can shift the blood into the systemic circulation, into the venous side of the systemic circulation. If it's coming from the GI tract, it's coming in close enough to the thoracic cavity that the respiratory pump and the heart will help to suck it back. If it's coming from the skin, that volume is going to be relying on skeletal muscle pump. People who have failing hearts generally don't have very strong skeletal muscles. Their heart's failing, they're not very active, they're going to lose that skeletal mass pretty quickly. You start to lose force of contraction and skeletal muscle within 3 days of not exercising on a regular basis. That's how quick you lose that. Okay, nourishment of the heart. Again, the heart only gets blood on the diastolic side of ventricular contraction and relaxation. Only fills on relaxation. The coronary blood flow, essential to keep the oxygen available for the mitochondria to make the ATP, which is going to cycle your cross bridges. So if you don't have ATP to release your myosin actin, you're locked in rigor. If your heart's in rigor, you don't pump. If your heart doesn't pump, you're gonna die. Coronary artery disease, called PAD, is referring to the fact that coronary arteries are diminishing blood flow out to the contractile muscle. Contractile muscles then see low O2 content, and that's called ischemia, lack of blood flow to the tissue, and hypoxia, which is the decrease in the oxygen delivery. Usually due to atherosclerotic plaque that's building up in the coronary blood vessel. The cholesterol and other fats get underneath the lining of the blood vessel, and that creates attraction for phagocytes into the area. They start to phagocytose, and calcium comes due to the chemicals they release. Smooth muscle leaves the wall of the arteries and comes into the area, and they start to get involved with accumulating fats, and it gets to be a really nasty mess. They get more and more congested underneath the lining, and that starts pushing out into the lumen of the blood vessel, and you get less blood past that area. So next graph, they're talking about blood flow in the left coronary artery. You see that during systole, the blood is actually either zero or about 50% of what it is during the diastolic portion of the heart. So at the end of systole, after the muscles are starting to relax, then the blood starts to flow into the coronary arteries. As the blood is leaving the area around the semilunar valves, because it's being distributed out into the other vessels, the delivery vessels, then the pressure in that on the area of the semilunar valves is going to drop. The volume is already dropping, and so the flow into the coronary arteries will go down. The aortic pressure, that's the dichrotic notch. So systole pushes the blood out. Diastole, the early diastole or end of systole, is going to start to pull the blood back towards the semilunar valves. That's when the greatest amount of blood is actually at the area of the semilunar valves. They shut. That's the dichrotic notch. And as soon as they shut, then the volume can start to enter your coronary blood vessels. Exercise. A lot of you are in KRS, so you should know this probably already. You increase metabolic activity, then the majority of your cells are using aerobic metabolism to do that. You support the high rate of metabolic activity in most of your cells via the oxygen being consumed, or actually the receptor for the electron in the electron transport chain. So the requirement for oxygen delivery to these tissues increases. Got an oxygen demand now. The adenosine, which is another name for your epinephrine, is going to go up as your sympathetic nervous system gets and starts to dial up with your skeletal muscle activity. Your adenosine is going to constrict the blood vessels in the GI tract. That's why you don't exercise right after eating, because you get abdominal cramps. It's going to dilate the coronary blood vessels so you can get more blood out to the coronary tissue. It's going to dilate the blood vessels that are going to skeletal muscle, and it's going to increase blood flow to cardiac and also skeletal muscle. Hopefully that increase in blood flow is going to meet the oxygen demand. Now the blood flow is limited by how much oxygen carrying capacity you have in your red blood cells, how many red blood cells you have, and also oxygenation at the lungs. So there's a lot of things that can limit this, but your body with your sympathetic nervous system and increase in the adenosine release will try to be able to counteract the consumption of oxygen and meet it with oxygen delivery. So this is a picture from your book about atherosclerotic plaque, and this can occur in any blood vessel. The heart attack, it will be, if it's in a coronary artery, you've got fat accumulating underneath the lining, and a lot of cells will migrate into that area. Smooth muscle from out here in the wall that normally would be constricting and dilating, those cells start to move into that area. Phagocytes, macrophages move into that area. They're consuming the fat and releasing chemicals that are going to increase calcium deposition. This becomes hard and rigid, and this area of the plaque formation now can't dilate and contract anymore. So you lose the ability to control your blood pressure, which is part of the problem with atherosclerosis. And then if this gets big enough that it occludes the lumen, then you've got blood flow distribution problems as well. So it's sort of a double whammy. You've got blood pressure problems and you've got blood flow problems. If part of that plaque should break off, then you've got embolus. An embolus, you translate that, it means a plug, and that's exactly what it does. It goes through your systemic circulation, so it runs into a vessel it can't get through, and it acts as a plug. Then any tissue downstream is going to have no oxygen delivered to it. If that's your heart attack. If that's in your brain, you've got a stroke. If it's in your lungs, usually the blood vessels rupture and your lungs collapse. It's made out of the plaque, so it could be a combination of blood cells, fibrin. Most likely it's going to be things that have stuck to the outside of the plaque formation. I can't get back. Things that, since the endothelial cells are exposed, then collagen is exposed, you have clots forming now from your clotting, your intrinsic clotting cascade. And those can be very fragile and break off and form emboli. Yeah. So the blood that's trying to go by starts fragmenting the clots, and then they become emboli. So here we've got the heart, got our coronary arteries, we've got an area of blood being blocked out here. If it's in one of the branches to a very small part of the heart, then you've got a limited effect on the heart. If it's a very, very small area, you might not even know you've had a heart attack because your heart will take care, it will form blood vessels that will go around the blockage, that's called collateral circulation, and it will be able to, if the cells have died, they will be replaced by new cardiac muscle cell, and person dies and you do a autopsy and you see, no, heart's fine, but they had small heart attack. If it's in a bigger vessel and too much damage is done that the cardiac myocytes don't repair before the fibroblasts get involved, and fibroblasts will always get involved as soon as there's any kind of inflammatory response, and an embolus will cause inflammation to occur. You have the fibroblasts irritated and they produce more connective tissue before the myocytes can repair. Then you've got a piece of the fibrous connective tissue in your heart that can't pump, so the heart becomes weakened. If you have a blockage that is way up here before you get to the circumflex, the diagonal, and the descending, you got big trouble because that whole left side of the heart is now not getting blood efficiently. Yes, there are anastomoses down here and blood can flow retrograde back, but remember the blood is flowing only in diastole. So in systole, there's no blood flow, so you're still ischemic, and you have the volume trying to feed its normal tissue plus the front of the heart. So this usually is going to be starved of blood. I'm not exactly sure why it's light purple and black, but black definitely those cells are going to die. Light purple, I'm assuming they're meaning, yeah, they're affected, but they're not totally deprived of blood because of the anastomoses that are down at the bottom here. And also in the back, you have anastomoses between right and left coronary arteries on the back of the heart. Some poor people, though, they have very little anastomosis on the back of the heart. So when one vessel gets blocked, they're in big time trouble. Okay, so delay and complications. I think I'll just let you look at that. Got some clicker questions that I'll give you on Tuesday. So I'll post the slides that aren't there. Some of the clicker questions apply to that, so look at it. Again, they're not being graded clicker questions, so if you get the answer wrong, it doesn't matter. But it would be nice if you get a head start. Remember, there's a lot